The shots kept coming, one after another, rolling off the red canyon walls in waves, folding back on themselves until the sound had nowhere left to go. The soldiers had been at it for hours. Some of them were shaking. Not from the cold, the October sun still had heat in the canyon's windless belly, but from something harder to name. A few had already put their rifles down and walked away, and the sergeants had let them go, because there was no regulation written for this, no field manual that covered what was happening on that canyon floor in the autumn of 1874. The horses screamed the way horses scream when they know. Over 1,000 of them, maybe 1,400. The records disagree on the number, and none of the men who were there seemed to want to count carefully afterward. This was the Red River War. Not a battle, not a last stand, not the kind of war that gets painted on a canvas and hung in a museum. Something older and colder than that. A war fought not to defeat an enemy, but to leave them with nothing. No food, no shelter, no way to move, no future that looked anything like the past. You know Little Bighorn, you know the name Custer, you know the image. Cavalry surrounded on a Montana hilltop, outnumbered, going down fighting. America loved that story, still loves it. There is something in it that sits comfortably in the national mythology. Brave men, honorable enemies, a glorious and doomed resistance that ended exactly the way a 19th century painter needed it to end. But Little Bighorn happened in 1876. 2 years before that, in the same decade, on the same plains, against the same people, the U.S. Army ran a different kind of campaign. One that didn't end with a heroic last stand. One that ended with a sound bouncing off redstone walls for hours on an October afternoon, and a silence afterward that the country pulled over itself like a blanket and never fully lifted. The question worth asking, the question that will sit underneath everything that follows, is not why the Red River War happened. Reasons were never in short supply. The question is why, in a country that has written 10,000 books about Custer's last hour, almost nobody knows this war took place at all. Hold that. We will come back to it. But first, you need to understand the machine that built it. By the early 1870s, the United States Army had been trying to solve the Southern Plains by force for the better part of a decade, and it had almost nothing to show for the effort. The problem was not numbers. The Army had numbers. The problem was not courage or equipment or supply. The problem was that the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Southern Cheyenne, and the Arapaho did not fight the way the Army knew how to fight. They did not hold ground. They did not form lines. They did not have supply depots that could be captured or headquarters that could be surrounded. They moved the way weather moves, without warning, without fixed position, across distances that exhausted pursuers before a single shot was fired. The Llano Estacado, the staked plains, was their greatest weapon. And it wasn't a weapon at all in the conventional sense. It was geography, a plateau the size of a small European nation, sitting above the surrounding landscape like a table that God had scraped flat with the back of his hand, featureless to the point of hallucination. No landmarks, no trees, no rivers that stayed where you mapped them. Early Spanish explorers had driven wooden stakes into the ground at intervals so they could find their way back out, and even that had not always worked. The Comanche had grown up on it. It was as familiar to them as the inside of their own lodges. They read it by memory and instinct and subtle signs that no outside observer could decode. A particular slant of wind off the caprock edge, a shift in the grass color that meant water at depth, the way certain clouds stacked against the escarpment in the early afternoon. The Army read it as an adversary. Cavalry columns that rode into the Llano Estacado tended to come back diminished, horses ruined by heat and thirst, men disoriented by the sameness of every horizon. The enemy found when the enemy chose to be found, and gone so completely when they chose otherwise, that it was easy to wonder, on the worst days of a fruitless summer campaign, whether they had been real at all. General Philip Sheridan had stopped wondering. He had also stopped believing that the answer was more cavalry or better scouts or faster columns. Sheridan had learned his real lesson not on the plains, but in Virginia, watching what William Sherman did to Georgia. You do not win a war against a people embedded in their own land by defeating their army. You win by destroying everything that allows life in that land to continue. You do not need to kill every fighter. You need to make every fighter understand that there is nothing left to fight for. The plan he put into motion in the summer of 1874 had a brutal elegance to it. 5 columns, 5 directions, all converging on the Texas Panhandle at the same time. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie from Fort Concho in the south, Colonel Nelson Miles from Fort Dodge in the north. 3 additional columns from the east and west, filling the gaps. Not one spearhead, aimed at a specific target. A net dropped across the entire landscape, with the walls drawing tighter week by week, until there was no longer any direction that was safe. The columns were not ordered to seek battle as a primary objective. They were ordered to deny rest, to find every camp and burn it, to find every food cache and destroy it, to find every herd of ponies and take them or scatter them, to make the Llano Estacado, the Plains nation's greatest geographic advantage, into a trap by being everywhere on it at once. The genius of it, if that word can be used for something so ugly, was that it targeted the structure of life on the plains rather than the fighters. The fighters could run. The children could not run as fast. The elderly could not run at all. The winter stores that had taken a summer to accumulate could not run. The horses could be scattered, but scattered horses on an open plain without a camp to return to were lost horses. In August, the heat did part of the work for free. The Llano Estacado in August is a landscape that seems designed to test the proposition that humans belong there at all. The sun rises before the air has fully cooled from the previous afternoon and sets without apologizing for what it did to the day. The ground reflects heat upward from the caliche and the dry clay. The horizon shimmers with water that isn't there, an evaporation mirage so convincing that men who knew better still found themselves steering toward it. Horses dropped on the march. Men cut open barrel cacti with their sabers and pressed their faces to the cut surface. A private in Nelson Miles's column wrote in his journal that by the 3rd week of August, he had mostly stopped thinking about the campaign and had replaced that entire mental space with a single, continuous thought about cold water. Then the Blue Northers arrived. A Blue Norther is what the plains people called the fast-moving cold fronts that come screaming down from the northern Rockies in autumn with almost no warning. The sky goes a particular shade of sickly green-gray. The temperature drops 40 degrees in the time it takes to set up a camp. Rain turns to sleet, turns to ground ice between dinner and midnight. Animals that were standing in 70-degree air at noon are dead in single digits by morning if they aren't sheltered. For the army columns, a Blue Norther was miserable, for the families running ahead of those columns with their children and their old people and whatever they had managed to carry out of the last camp before it was burned. A Blue Norther was a threat with a body count. Every storm was a calculation. How much warmth was left in the robes they still had? How much fuel was within reach? Whether the fire they needed to survive the night would produce smoke that a scout could see in the morning? How long the youngest children could be kept from crying loudly enough to carry on the cold air? They were exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical. Weeks of running, of fragmentary sleep, of eating less than necessary because the hunts were being interrupted and the caches were being burned. The kind of exhaustion that starts to affect judgment, that makes a person want to stop, to stand, to accept whatever comes, because the effort of continued motion has begun to feel less survivable than stillness. And somewhere to the south and east, hidden in the flat earth in a way that the army hadn't discovered yet, there was a place where that motion could stop, a place of warmth and water and grass and shelter, a place where the winter could be endured rather than fled. The bands were moving toward Palo Duro Canyon. You cannot understand Palo Duro from a photograph, and you cannot fully understand it from a description, but try. Stand on the edge of the Llano Estacado. Behind you, in every direction, is absolute flatness. The same grass, the same calish, the same white sky pressing down on a horizon so uniform that your eyes begin to invent landmarks that aren't there. Then look down, the earth falls away. 1,000 feet in places of striated red and white and deep ochre canyon wall, the layers of geological time laid out like a record of everything that happened here before humans arrived to argue about it. At the bottom, moving through cottonwoods that in late September are burning gold against the red stone, the prairie dog town fork of the Red River runs cold and clear. The canyon floor is wide in places, 6 miles in the wider sections, and the grass there is still green because the wind that scours the plateau above can't reach it. The walls cut the wind. The walls hold heat. The walls make the canyon floor a different climate from the landscape it's hidden in. The Comanche had been wintering here for generations. It was not a place of last resort. It was a place of preference. A place where the bands gathered when the cold came, because everything necessary for winter survival was present in abundance. Water, grass for the horses, wood for the fires, walls that blocked the northers, depth that made it invisible from the surrounding plains, unless you knew exactly where the entrance cuts were located in the caprock. By late September 1874, multiple bands were settling in. Comanche, Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne. Families unpacking winter camps, laying out the lodges along the canyon floor, beginning the long process of settling into the rhythms of a cold season encampment. Children running in the golden light among the cottonwoods. Horses grazing on the canyon grass in a herd that represented years and years of accumulated wealth. Breeding, trading, raiding, the slow building of a resource that was more than a resource. The Comanche relationship with the horse was not comparable to any other culture's relationship with any animal. It was foundational in the way that language is foundational. The horse was how they thought about distance, about power, about what was possible. A man's horses were his freedom made material. A band's horse herd was its civilization made mobile and sustainable. To take the horses was not to impoverish a cavalry. It was to sever something that had no clean name in English. There were perhaps 1,400 horses grazing in Palo Duro Canyon in the last week of September 1874. On the morning of the 28th, Mackenzie's Tonkawa scouts found the entrance to the canyon and looked over the rim. What they saw and what they reported back to Mackenzie in the next hour was the location of a target that Sheridan's entire strategy had been designed to find without knowing where it was. Mackenzie ordered the descent immediately. The upper canyon walls were not a trail. They were a barely negotiable cliff face with enough loose rock and enough vertical drop that getting horses down them at all required a level of careful patience that sits poorly next to the urgency of a military assault. Each horse had to be led with its haunches, almost touching the slope, hooves, searching for purchase on rock that shifted, the animal's weight pulling against the soldier's grip, as both of them moved through the upper sections in something that was less a descent than a controlled fall, arrested at intervals by whatever was stable underfoot. The column moved in near silence, not because silence was ordered, though it was, but because the alternative to silence was noise, and noise carried in the canyon. Sound moved differently in that enclosed space. It traveled upward and outward and came back changed, and no one in Mackenzie's column wanted to hear their own noise coming back to them from the canyon walls before they reached the bottom. They reached the bottom. The attack moved fast. Warriors who were already awake caught the motion first and went toward the soldiers rather than away from them, covering the ground between the army's line and the camps with whatever time they had, which was not much, but was enough. Women and children moved into the side canyons, the narrow branching passages that cut back into the canyon walls like capillaries from the main artery of the canyon floor. Old men who had survived their fighting years took positions in the rocks and did not leave them. The fighting was loud and close, and over in a period of time that none of the accounts agree on, but which was probably less than an hour of genuine engagement. Mackenzie's casualties were 4 wounded, no soldiers killed. It was not a battle, it was a raid with an army behind it. And what Mackenzie wanted was not in the fighting. He moved through the camps with his orders clear in his mind, and his officers moved with him, and the soldiers who came behind them began the work that Sheridan had designed this entire campaign around reaching. The tipis burned one by one, and the fires were fed with everything the camps contained. The dried buffalo meat that families had spent weeks accumulating. The pemmican pressed into blocks and cached against February. The dried berries and roots, and the rendered fat that made the difference between enough calories in a cold month and not enough. The robes of buffalo hide that were years in the making, scraped and tanned and smoked until they were as supple as cloth and as warm as anything the plains could produce. The blankets, the clothing, the tools, the objects whose value was not merely practical but ceremonial, whose loss meant not just material poverty, but the severing of connections to knowledge and tradition that took generations to accumulate and moments to burn. The medicine bundles went into the flames too. Objects that had no replacement. Knowledge encoded in physical form, in the arrangement of specific things gathered across years, the kind of thing that when it is gone completely, because the people who knew how to make it again were now running into side canyons trying to keep their children alive. When the camps were ash, Mackenzie turned to the horses. His officers understood the order before he finished giving it. One of them, Captain Robert Carter, whose memoir would be one of the more careful accounts of the campaign, wrote afterward with the precision of a man constructing a legal record. He described the order. He described his men carrying it out. He did not describe what he felt, and the careful absence of feeling in his account describes it more completely than any admission would have. The order was to shoot them all, not to scatter them, not to redistribute them to army remount stations, which would have been the practical military response to a captured herd of this size, not to drive them north and sell them, which would have been financially sensible, to shoot them, everyone, there in the canyon, with the fires of the camp still smoking and the October sun crossing the red walls and the river running cold below. The shooting started in the early afternoon. It did not stop until the canyon was failing into shadow. A horse weighing 1,000 pounds does not die quickly from a single rifle shot placed carelessly. The men working through the herd were soldiers, not slaughterers, and they were doing this job on an open canyon floor surrounded by the animals' noise and movement and the accumulating weight of what they were doing, and the shots were not always placed well, and the animals did not cooperate with their own deaths, and the work went on. The canyon walls held the sound. That is the specific detail that appears, in different language and from different men, in nearly every account that touches on this moment. The walls held the sound. The canyon, which was designed by its own geology to trap warmth and block wind, also trapped the noise of what was happening at its bottom and returned it, changed and multiplied, to the men who were making it, hour after hour. The sound of what they were doing given back to them from the red stone above. Some soldiers put down their rifles and walked away. The sergeants let them go. There was no regulation for this. There is a kind of tiredness that is not about muscles. The men who stayed until the end carried that tiredness out of the canyon, and, from what little evidence exists of their later lives, most of them carried it for a long time. What Mackenzie had destroyed was not the Comanche military capacity in any narrow sense. A fighting force can be rebuilt. Weapons can be replaced. Warriors can recover from a tactical defeat. What he had destroyed, what Sheridan had designed the entire campaign to destroy, was the foundation beneath the fighting force. The food that would have fed the warriors through winter. The warmth that would have kept the children alive. The horses that were not just transport, but the entire enabling condition of life on the southern plains. Without the horses, the bands that had escaped into the canyon's side passages could not hunt at any effective range, could not cover the distances needed to avoid the army columns still moving across the Llano Estacado, could not make it to any seasonal resource before the winter locked the ground, could not, in the most basic terms, survive as they had lived. The spine of it had been broken, not a military structure, a civilization, the thing that had held together through a century of pressure from the Spanish, through the wars with other plains nations, through every previous engagement with the United States Army, had been broken on an October afternoon in a canyon in the Texas Panhandle, not by superior force in battle, but by the targeted destruction of every material condition that made survival possible. What came after Palo Duro was not a campaign. It was a reckoning, slow and cold, and conducted in the currency of hunger. The bands that climbed out of the canyon's side passages onto the Llano Estacado found the plains waiting for them in October. No horses, no food, no robes for the temperature that was already dropping and would drop further. The Blue Northers were not finished with the season. The ground was beginning its long process of freezing, and the grass was dying back, and the buffalo that remained in the region were harder to approach on foot than from horseback, in ways that were not merely a matter of speed. They moved toward the reservations because the arithmetic of alternatives had been reduced to nothing, not as a military decision, not as diplomacy. They moved the way a person moves towards shelter when the cold has become a certainty and the open ground has become a threat. One family at a time, across weeks, across the distances between the Llano Estacado and Fort Sill in Indian Territory. Each arrival at the agency gates quieter than anything the officers there had been expecting. Each face carrying the particular blankness of people who have spent weeks performing the calculation of what it costs to survive and have recently learned the full price. There was a Kiowa woman. Her complete name did not survive the ethnographic record, who spoke about the walk in an interview conducted decades later, when she was old enough that the interviewer expected sentiment and memory and perhaps elaboration. She said she had wrapped her youngest child in her own clothing. She said she had walked. The interviewer waited. She had nothing to add. She said, "I walked. Sit with that for a moment. 20 miles. In October, in a dress because the ropes were ash in a canyon 2 days behind her, with a child wrapped in whatever warmth she had left." And the sentence she chose to describe it, the sentence that survived across 50 years and a translation and an interviewer's transcription, was 2 words: "I walked." Those 2 words contain everything that the Red River War produced, and everything that the national mythology chose not to examine. The cold, the distance, the specific weight of a child who is not walking under his own power. The moment, somewhere on that plain, when the body says stop and the decision is made to continue anyway. The absence of heroism in the conventional sense, no charge, no last stand, no dramatic gesture that makes a good painting, and the presence of something that is harder to look at than heroism. Quanah Parker came into the agency at Fort Sill in June 1875. He was approximately 30 years old. He had been born to a Comanche chief and a white captive woman, and had lived his entire conscious life as Comanche, had raided, had led warriors, had been one of the principals in the events that brought the Army's campaign down on the southern plains. He walked into the agency without the ceremony of a formal surrender, because there was no formal surrender to be had. There was only walking in, because everything else had been removed as an option. The officers at Fort Sill filed the appropriate paperwork. The campaign was officially concluded. The reports went up the chain of command to Sheridan, who reviewed them and found them satisfactory, and to Sherman, who found them satisfactory as well. The Red River War was over. The southern plains were pacified. The problem that had resisted solution for a decade had been solved. Mackenzie received his commendations, and the country began, in the way that countries begin these things, Not with a decision, not in a single conversation, but gradually, through 1,000 small choices about attention and emphasis, to put the Red River War somewhere that it could not easily be found. Here is the thing that should not sit easily with anyone. 2 years after the Red River War ended, in the summer of 1876, George Armstrong Custer led 268 soldiers into the valley of the Little Bighorn River in Montana and lost them all. It was a tactical catastrophe, born of arrogance and bad intelligence, and a command structure that had been given too much autonomy and exercised it badly. Custer died on a hill. 267 other men died in the grass and the ravines below him, and the country, which was looking for something to do with the grief and the shock, made it a monument. Paintings, poems, congressional investigations, competing survivor accounts published within weeks of the battle, biographies of Custer that ran to multiple volumes, films beginning in the silent era and continuing without interruption through the 20th century. Arguments about tactics, about Reno's decisions, about whether Custer knew what he was riding into that are still generating academic papers today. The Red River War produced no paintings, no films, no competing accounts published in the immediate aftermath, because no one in the Eastern press was watching, and the Army's own reports were written in the flat institutional language of operational success. It appears in some histories in a paragraph, in others in a sentence. In the curricula of most American schools, it does not appear at all. Little Bighorn is in the story. The Red River War is not. And the reason is not mystery. The reason is that the two events served different narrative functions for a country that was in the process of constructing a story about itself that it wanted to be able to live with. Little Bighorn was a defeat, and a defeat in the right framing is usable. A golden-haired general dying, outnumbered on a hill, is a tragedy that confirms the heroism of the cause, even in failure. The Plains nations become a worthy adversary, fierce, admirable, doomed, who tested the best the army had to offer and found it wanting in one engagement before the inevitable conclusion of history swept them away. It is a story in which everyone performs their assigned role with a kind of grandeur, and the outcome, however terrible in the moment, points towards something the country considered its destiny. The Red River War offered no such service. What it offered was the most effective strategy against the Comanche and Kiowa and Cheyenne on the southern plains was to burn their food, shoot their horses, and wait for the cold to finish the work. What it offered was a Kiowa woman in a dress walking 20 miles with her child in October. What it offered was the deliberate, authorized, institutionally celebrated destruction of the material conditions of a civilization, not in the heat of battle, but as a planned operational objective designed in Washington and executed over 4 months by professional soldiers following orders from the highest levels of the United States military command. That is not a story that fits on a monument. It is not a story that sits comfortably next to manifest destiny, without requiring the phrase to mean something more explicit than progress. It is not a story that the 19th century's preferred genre of frontier mythology, the heroic cavalry, the savage but noble enemy, the inevitable westward march, had any mechanism for absorbing. So the country made its choices: what to teach, what to paint, what name to put on a battlefield park in Montana, and what to leave as unmarked grass in the Texas Panhandle. What kind of war to remember as a defining national experience, and what kind of war to file in the operational records and leave there. The Llano Estacado became cattle country. The canyon became a state park. The Comanche and Kiowa were confined to reservations in Oklahoma, where the buffalo, the last material foundation of the civilization that the Red River War had broken, were commercially hunted to functional extinction within a decade. By the mid-1880s, the herds that had moved across the plains, in numbers that early European observers described as incomprehensible, that had sustained the plains cultures for centuries, were gone. Quanah Parker became a rancher. He became, in the early 20th century, a figure of some public prominence. A man who had survived the collision of two worlds by learning to operate in the one that had destroyed the other without pretending the two were the same world, or that the transition between them had been anything other than what it was. He died in 1911. His photograph survives. He looks at the camera with the expression of a man who has thought carefully about what he is willing to show. History is not what happened. That is the closest thing to a lesson that the Red River War offers, and it is not a comfortable one. History is what a society decides it can afford to remember, and what it decides the story it tells about itself requires, and what it builds in the spaces where other things used to be. Little Bighorn has a national monument. The Red River War has a historical marker in a state park and a paragraph in the footnotes of specialized military histories, and a sound that, if you listen for it in the canyon on a certain kind of October afternoon, still hasn't fully died away. The question of what your country chose to forget and what it built in the silence is not an abstract one. It is a question about right now. What do you think was buried? Not just the Red River War, the war before it, the massacre after it, the campaign that never made the textbook, because the truth of what it required was too direct to be useful to the story. Name it below, because this war is not the only one. It is barely the beginning.